December 17, 1944, dawned icy cold over the dense forests of Belgium. Sergeant Jim Morrison crouched in his foxhole, teeth chattering, as a distant rumble hinted at what every infantryman dreaded: German tanks. For 2 long years, American soldiers had learned the hard way that a tank meant almost certain death. Rifles bounced harmlessly off thick armor. Grenades demanded close range that few survived. And the bazooka, their supposed salvation, had proven to be little more than a cruel joke. Soldiers assigned to bazooka teams rarely returned from the field. Officers stopped sending men to those roles, and the weapon earned a reputation that terrified everyone who relied on it. Morrison's unit had spent months listening to the stories, panicked shouts as armored giants crushed foxholes, the smoke of burning fields, and the hopelessness of being trapped under a steel behemoth. Every plan seemed doomed before it began. Yet this morning, something had changed. Slid under Morrison's pack was a small, unassuming rocket stamped with strange markings, unlike any he had seen before. The supply sergeant had handed it over in secrecy, speaking only 2 words: "Don't waste them." That was all the warning anyone needed. No explanation, no instruction, just a silent promise that this was different. As the German Panzers ground closer, Morrison's mind raced. He remembered the countless friends lost to these metal monsters. He remembered the futility of his previous attempts with conventional bazooka rounds. But today, in this frozen forest, the rules were about to change. The cold air carried the low growl of tank engines, and he felt the weight of history pressing down. Soldiers in foxholes nearby were whispering about what they'd heard in rumors, something called a shaped charge, a secret weapon that could pierce armor like a hot knife through butter. They didn't understand how it worked, only that it worked. Morrison gripped the bazooka, his hands trembling despite the layers of gloves. The first Panzer emerged between the skeletal trees, its tracks crunching snow and ice. His heart pounded in rhythm with the tank's approaching roar. He recalled what the supply sergeant had said: "Don't waste them." He aimed carefully at the lead tank's thick frontal armor, the spot that had always guaranteed failure in the past. He exhaled, fired, and watched in tense silence. For a moment, nothing happened. The tank loomed, monstrous and invulnerable, until suddenly it shuddered. The metal seemed to sigh, and then, without a single outward explosion, it froze, lifeless from the inside. The crew had no chance. The rumor was real. The forest echoed with the stunned silence of soldiers who had witnessed the impossible. Morrison didn't celebrate, there was no time, but he allowed himself a brief private relief. This weapon, small enough to carry on a soldier's shoulder, had just rewritten the rules of engagement. For years, infantry had been helpless against tanks, but now, for the first time, they had a tool that could level the playing field. The Germans would notice this change, and they would fear it. In those frozen minutes, as the morning mist hovered over shattered branches and churned snow, Morrison realized the weight of what he held. This was not just a rocket, it was a promise of survival, a weapon that could turn desperation into power. The psychological cost of combat had been immense, but now, armed with the M6A3 HEAT round, soldiers like him had hope. Hope that even in the deadliest situations, ingenuity and courage could make the impossible possible. And in the shadows of the Belgian forest, the legend of the Panzer Killers was born. The morning after Morrison's first encounter with the tanks, word spread quietly through the ranks about the new secret weapon. No one outside the engineers' labs truly understood how it worked, only that it could turn the tables in an instant. The M6A3 HEAT round was unlike anything soldiers had ever seen. Traditional explosives relied on brute force, exploding on impact, but the HEAT round concentrated its energy in a single, terrifying way. It focused the blast into a narrow jet of molten copper, traveling at 25,000 feet per second, 7 times the speed of sound. That pencil-thin stream of metal didn't just punch holes in armor, it literally sliced through steel at a molecular level. Soldiers had been trained to think of tanks as nearly invincible, yet here was a weapon that could kill them from a distance without any dramatic explosion, without the risk of rushing into a suicide attack. Engineers had developed the HEAT round in strict secrecy, understanding that if word got out, the entire balance of armored warfare could shift overnight. For years, the conventional bazooka had failed. Its rockets would bounce off German Panzers, sparking frustration and fear. Soldiers had laughed nervously at the thought of charging tanks with a weapon that could not pierce their armor. Now, with the M6A3, that fear was slowly turning into lethal confidence. The round was compact, designed to fit into the familiar bazooka tube, but it carried power that seemed impossible for its size. It was a marvel of science and desperation, combining chemical energy, precise engineering, and innovative physics into something small enough for a single soldier to carry. In the field, the effect was almost magical. Infantrymen who had previously felt helpless now approached their foxholes with cautious optimism. Rumors of its capabilities spread quickly, whispered during brief lulls in combat. A single shot could immobilize a tank. A single soldier could hold a defensive line that had been doomed the day before. Yet with that power came responsibility. Supply sergeants warned their teams repeatedly not to waste these rounds, emphasizing patience and precision. Each rocket was valuable, a secret that could not be squandered in reckless fire. Even among the soldiers who had seen it work, understanding was limited. Few could grasp the exact physics behind the shaped charge, but they didn't need to. The results were clear. Steel that had seemed impervious now yielded to a single well-aimed shot. The battlefield dynamic was shifting before their eyes. No longer were tanks the untouchable giants of war. They were now vulnerable human-sized targets in the forest and on the plains. Soldiers began to dream of possibilities they had never dared imagine, and fear started to take a new form, not the paralyzing terror of helplessness, but a cautious respect for the weapon they now wielded. By the time Morrison and his team returned to their foxholes later that day, the HEAT round had already begun to change everything, not just the tactics, but the psychology of warfare itself. Where once men had feared tanks with every fiber of their being, now they carried hope along with their bazookas, a quiet belief that even the most armored monsters could be defeated. In a war dominated by steel and fire, the M6A3 HEAT round proved that science, secrecy, and courage could combine to create something far more deadly than brute force alone. It was a turning point, and though most would never know the full story for decades, every soldier who held that rocket understood one undeniable truth: the impossible had become possible.
The forest was eerily quiet as Sergeant Morrison peered over the edge of his foxhole. The first Panzer had already appeared at the far end of the clearing, its massive tracks crushing frozen undergrowth beneath them. He could hear the metallic clank of its treads and the soft murmur of the engine, a sound that had haunted soldiers for years. Every instinct screamed caution. Every training exercise had warned of the futility of attacking a tank with anything smaller than artillery. Yet in his hands, Morrison held a chance, a secret weapon that could rewrite the rules of war in the span of a single moment. He lined up the M6A3 HEAT round in the bazooka, the strange markings catching the dim winter light. He remembered the supply sergeant's words, "Don't waste them." He exhaled, steadying his aim on the thick frontal armor that had once seemed untouchable. The first rocket launched with a soft roar, streaking toward the Panzer. For a heartbeat, it seemed as though nothing had happened. Then, as if touched by some invisible force, the tank shuddered violently. The steel groaned and warped, and Morrison saw the impossible. The monster stilled, motionless, as if life had been drained from it without a single outward explosion. The crew inside had no chance, victims of a copper jet traveling faster than sound, slicing through steel as if it were paper. The second Panzer was only seconds away, and Morrison barely allowed himself time to reload. Every movement was tense, deliberate, a careful dance with death. The heat round felt heavier now, not in weight, but in consequence. Soldiers behind him held their breath, eyes wide as the next rocket streaked forward. It struck true, and again the impossible happened. The tank lurched, then fell silent, frozen in place by a force no one outside the engineers' laboratories had fully understood. Morrison didn't cheer. There was no time. The forest still hid dangers, but for the first time he felt the power of choice in battle, a sense that the impossible could be conquered with skill, courage, and the right technology. Watching from the shadows, other infantrymen began to whisper. The legend of the Panzer Killer was already taking shape. No longer were tanks untouchable icons of fear. They had become targets, vulnerable to the smallest of soldiers, armed with the smallest of rockets. For Morrison, the moment was surreal, a combination of awe and horror. He had just killed 2 tanks from a single foxhole, and yet the cost of failure had never been clearer. One misstep, one wasted round, could still mean death. But the heat round had changed the very rules of survival, allowing infantry to fight back against the steel giants that had dominated the battlefield for years. In the aftermath, the forest seemed to hold its breath. Smoke from crushed snow and frozen earth hung faintly in the air, carrying the scent of oil and metal. Morrison lowered his bazooka, feeling a mix of relief and dread. The heat round had not only destroyed tanks, it had shifted the balance of power. Word would spread, eventually reaching German tank crews who would come to fear the American infantry in ways they had never imagined. Morrison understood the stakes. Each shot was more than a weapon against metal. It was a message to the enemy that their armor no longer guaranteed safety. As the morning sun began to pierce the mist, Morrison and his comrades took stock of what had just happened. The impossible had been achieved. 2 tanks destroyed in under 30 seconds by the steady hands of a single soldier and the brilliance of secret engineering. The battlefield had changed forever, and every soldier who witnessed it felt the tremors of a new era of warfare. Morrison tucked the remaining heat rounds close to his chest, knowing that more challenges lay ahead, but also feeling the first flicker of confidence that American infantry could, against all odds, stand against the armored monsters of the German army.
The word spread quickly through the frozen forests and snow-covered villages. The Americans had a weapon the Germans feared. Soldiers whispered the new nickname among themselves, Panzer Killers. The German tank crews, once bold and relentless, now approached each battlefield with caution, scanning for hidden infantry who might be armed with the mysterious bazooka and its deadly HEAT rounds. Where once tanks had moved with the confidence of indestructible giants, now they hesitated, engines rumbling nervously as if they sensed an invisible threat. For the first time, the psychological balance of power had shifted. Morrison and his comrades noticed it immediately. Patrols that had previously been terrified of advancing near armored columns now moved with a new sense of purpose. The knowledge that a single soldier with the right weapon could destroy a tank from a distance altered the dynamic of every engagement. Infantrymen who had once prayed for artillery support began to believe they could take matters into their own hands. The battlefield was no longer a one-sided contest of steel and fire. It was a chessboard, and the Americans had just placed a new, unpredictable piece on it. The Germans, meanwhile, were equally aware of the change. After the first reports of tanks being destroyed from seemingly impossible positions, officers grew cautious. Commanders who had once driven toward the front lines with near invincibility now paused, wary of hidden threats. The nickname Panzer Murder was both a confession and a curse, a recognition of fear. They did not admire the Americans for their ingenuity, they dreaded them. Every approach became a gamble. Every maneuver was shadowed by the thought that a single HEAT round could end their mission and their lives in seconds. For the infantry, the weapon's psychological impact was just as profound. Soldiers who had lived in constant terror of tanks found a newfound confidence. The fear of the impossible was replaced by cautious determination. Training shifted as well, with teams learning to maximize the potential of each HEAT round, calculating angles, distances, and timing with precision. The battlefield itself seemed to bend to their advantage, with terrain and cover now meaningful in a way it hadn't been before. The line between life and death still existed, but for the first time in years, soldiers could influence it. Yet the cost of wielding this power was never far from mind. Each shot required calm nerves, steady hands, and exact aim. Mistakes could be fatal. Every soldier carrying an HEAT round understood the weight of responsibility resting on their shoulders. Morrison remembered the first moment he fired at the lead Panzer, feeling the tension in every muscle, knowing that failure would mean instant death. That tension lingered, even as victories piled up. The new weapon had given them power, but it had also deepened the gravity of every decision. In a matter of days, the forest echoed with the lessons of this new warfare. The Germans adjusted tactics, retreating when necessary and spreading caution throughout their ranks. The Americans, armed with knowledge and the M6A3 HEAT round, gained confidence with each successful engagement. What had begun as a simple tool of survival had transformed into a strategic advantage that altered the course of battle. Every soldier who carried the bazooka knew they were no longer just infantry. They were hunters of steel giants, the fearsome Panzer Killers the enemy would come to dread. By nightfall, Morrison reflected on what had changed in just a few days. The HEAT round had not only destroyed tanks, it had shattered assumptions, rewritten tactics, and reshaped the psychology of war. The battlefield itself seemed different, alive with possibility. Soldiers no longer felt powerless against the armor that had once dominated them. They were no longer merely reacting, they were choosing, acting, and sometimes surviving against odds that had once seemed insurmountable. The legend of the Panzer Killers was not just born from technology, but from courage, ingenuity, and the unyielding will of men who refused to be overwhelmed by steel and fear. The battlefields of Belgium and beyond were never the same after the introduction of the M6A3 HEAT round. For the soldiers who carried it, the weapon was more than a piece of technology. It was a lifeline, a way to face armored giants without certain death. Morrison tucked the remaining rounds into his pack, feeling the weight of responsibility with every step. These small rockets were not just explosives, they were the culmination of secret engineering, years of testing, and countless calculations that most soldiers could barely comprehend. Yet in the field, the results were undeniable. The impossible had become real. The full scope of the heat round's impact would remain classified for decades. Engineers and military strategists knew that the principles behind it, the shaped charge, the copper jet moving at incredible speeds, could revolutionize warfare if widely understood. That is why it remained a secret for 30 years, hidden away from the world, while soldiers like Morrison carried its deadly promise into combat. Modern weapons from RPGs to Tau missiles and the Javelin would one day trace their lineage directly back to this small rocket. But in 1944, it was the future in miniature, held in the hands of those brave enough to use it. The psychological impact on both sides was profound. German tank crews approached battlefields with hesitation, their confidence shaken by the invisible threat of a bazooka and its devastating round. Every angle, every movement, every potential hiding spot now carried a lethal possibility. The American infantry, once terrified of armored columns, felt an empowerment they had never known.
For the first time, soldiers could stand their ground and even shape the outcome of a fight against seemingly invincible machines. Hope had returned, forged from secrecy, science, and courage. Morrison often reflected on the paradox of the weapon. It made infantry powerful, yet it demanded extreme discipline. Every shot had to count. Each decision could mean the difference between survival and instant death. The rounds were not endless, and the Germans would adapt if given the chance. Every engagement was a delicate balance of precision, patience, and nerve. Yet with every panzer felled by a single soldier, the legend of the Panzer Killers grew. Stories of courage spread quietly through units, inspiring confidence and a new understanding of the infantry's role in modern warfare. By the end of the campaign, the battlefield had been transformed. What once had been a one-sided contest, dominated by armor and firepower, became a complex dance of tactics, fear, and opportunity. Soldiers learned that intelligence and technology could equal brute strength. The heat round had given infantry the ability to rewrite the rules of engagement, turning despair into determination and helplessness into lethal effectiveness. Morrison and his comrades understood they had witnessed a turning point, a moment when small, calculated ingenuity altered the course of history. Even decades later, the memory of holding that tiny, deadly rocket remained vivid in the minds of those who had carried it. The M6A3 HEAT round was not just a weapon, it was a symbol of what could be achieved when courage, science, and secrecy came together. It reshaped tactics, inspired generations of engineers and soldiers, and proved that no machine, no matter how powerful, was truly invincible. The legend of the Panzer Killers lived on, not just in the destruction of tanks, but in the transformation of warfare itself, and in the hearts of those who had dared to face steel and survive.